Thank you very much. Next item is the Hearings Panel's report on Hagley Oval Lighting Towers proposed lease, and I'd like the chair of the Hearings Panel to present the report, who is Councillor Coker.
So I've got a few things to say to sort of summarise the process that we went through. So the first was just to, again, I want to acknowledge a lot of the audience that are here who made submissions to the hearings panel. I want to remind that the hearings panel went in with an open mind about this process. We didn't have any preconceived views, so that was important, and it was a challenging process as well, I think, for us because of the issue around the Section 71 process, and that we could only consider the lease aspect and not look at it from an RMA perspective, which made it difficult because that's what a lot of the submissions were around. And it's very hard to look at it from a very narrow perspective like that. It's important to consider as well that Hagley Park has got sort of a long-standing heritage in Christchurch. It's the lungs of our city, and there isn't a person in Christchurch when we think of this city that we don't think of Hagley Park, so it's really important. So with the considerations, there was a lot of things that we couldn't consider that people brought along, and a lot of that was around benefits to the city, around economic considerations, so hospitality. A lot of the deputations were in support of those aspects, and they were things that we couldn't be thinking of. And the other thing was that a lot of this, most of the submissions were in support. So it was 93% of submissions were in support, 7% were against. But if you have a look at the report, I tried to cover as much as I could. I didn't cover everything, and I did go into aspects that probably weren't completely relevant to the decision in terms of what we were allowed to consider. But if I can find it, all the reason, I can't find the page. Just give me a second. So on page 114, I listed out a number of the reasons for why we felt the hearings panel that we could support it. Currently, there's 4 lighting poles that are allowed, and we were looking at just increasing that to 6. Of course, the big difference being that these poles are not retractable, that they would be permanent. And then there was a number of other reasons that you can see listed there. But when I was looking at it as the chair, I was really considering the concerns of the submitters, people that brought things they were worried about, and I wanted to make sure that we could rule those out or see those as things that were not significant enough to not go ahead with a decision for this lease. Probably the biggest concern in a way was around visual amenity and open space integrity of Hagley Park. So we looked at the Hagley management plan, Hagley Park management plan, those sorts of things. So that one is probably the most subjective aspect of it, because it does say in the Hagley Park management plan about maintaining long vistas of view. So that was probably, for me and I guess the panel, probably the most subjective part of it. But I think we all felt, because we were unanimous in our decision, that that was a relatively minor effect. Not to use that sort of terminology, but I would, really, at the end of the day, that's a decision for Poto Williams to be making about the height of the towers and the effect that they will have anyhow. But other things that we considered as well were people brought along concerns about commercial activity and the exclusiveness of Hagley Oval. Well, the Reserves Act allows for 40 days of the year where that space can be closed off to the public, but you're able to pay to enter. So that seemed it's allowable under the law. There were concerns around hazards, traffic concerns, car parks, the flying of helicopters. All of those things seem to be accounted for with the flight paths of the helicopters. We've been shown that information. The CDHB was in support. They have there's parking and traffic management plans that go on with each event that occurs. So that seemed to be all considered. Someone mentioned about wildlife as well. That's not something we really can consider, but it was something that was not considered to be an issue, and that would be the case if you look at the fact that 4 lighting towers were allowed anyhow previously. Yeah, so I don't know. That's the end of, unless you have any particular questions. I'm trying to summarise it, but yeah. So I'll leave it there.
No, it's an excellent report, and thank you. It's and I understand that you did a lot of the writing yourself, so it's much appreciated by your colleagues. I've got staff here as well, so has anyone got any questions? Jimmy Chen and Yanni Johansson.
I just want to ask one question, particularly regarding to the hearing panel, the final recommendation, paragraph 1.25. Those are the visual amended issue. You know, hearing panel mentioned there's a minor concern or major concern. Those one have any objective criteria, no major or minor, or is just based on your here is a relative a minor concern. I just want to know that's objective or subjective. Those one. It's my question.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, sorry. Yep.
Regardless of issue is minor or major, whether have objective criteria in there, that's minor, that's major, or just relative.
Minor or major are usually terms applied in an RMA context. I think as the chair of the hearings panel pointed out, there wasn't a lot in that realm that could be considered, but the impact on the open space values of the management plan was really the only thing that can be considered. It's not really for staff to make a judgment on that now. The hearings panel have done that. As Councillor Coker pointed out, they considered that to be relatively minor, in the context that there is already approval for 4 floodlights that can be raised to that same height.
Okay, thank you.
Yanni?
Thank you. I just wanted to check several things. One is, if we approve the lease today, but the Minister doesn't approve the changes, what happens to the lease?
The existing lease will remain, and the Canterbury Cricket Trust will have to make a decision on whether they wish to proceed through an RMA process back to the Environment Court or not.
So what happens to our decision today, though? Do you mean this lease that we're currently considering today still remains?
The variations of the current lease is unlikely to be needed. So we'll have to work out whether it needs to come back to you to actually rescind the resolution, or whether it just, they never enter into that lease, that variation.
Right. So why are we not waiting for the Minister to make a decision before we're considering this?
Because they made an application to us at the same time as the Minister, and we need to deal with the application that they made to us. And they're 2 separate processes, so...
Okay. And I appreciate that. I think you've had some clarity around the helicopter flight path, the issues that have been raised with CAA. So did you want to just talk about how that issue will be addressed?
Sure. I mean, it's a normal business process for any development. Council staff will engage with the relevant authorities as any detailed designs are unravelled to mitigate any potential impacts. So, should this proceed, I would expect that the Canterbury Cricket Trust will work with council staff, the Civil Aviation Authority and the CDHB to make sure any matters relating to flight paths and safety are dealt with.
Right. And just the final question, just in regards to the timing and the sequencing around the lights being installed, was there any consideration around timeframes for which the lease gives in terms of erecting the light towers? I mean, if they're not erected by a certain date, does the sort of lease change or default, or is there any consideration around, the time sequencing around if we give approval, then on what conditions are there in terms of actually the work happening?
I'm sorry, I'm not completely familiar with the lease. Unfortunately, the lawyer who was involved in the leasing side of it is away on leave. And
So my
So will the lease come back
understanding,
to
my
us?
understanding is, if the question is, if it takes them 3 or 4 years to implement the lighting towers, when will the lease expire? Is that your question?
So previously there was concern when council initially went in around seeing the business plan to ensure that the work happened. You'll recall the initial decision. So I was just trying to get some sense of, is this just an open-ended kind of time frame for which the lights have to be installed, or is there a kind of date by which we're doing this because of
So my understanding is the current lease doesn't have a sunset clause for the erection, nor would this one.
but there is an expiry date on the lease,
Of course,
which
is
applies no
quite
matter
far in
when they
the
erect
future.
the lights.
Yeah, and so sorry, just to be clear, will the lease come back to us once we approve this today, or?
Typically, no. No, once the decision's made, it's, our council leasing team will draw up the lease.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Melanie, would you like to move the motion?
Yep.
Do I have a seconder? Anne Galloway. Is there any discussion? Andrew?
Just very briefly, just noting that 3 of the 4 members of the hearing panel, including the chair, are brand new councillors. I'd like to thank the hearings panel for their work and commend them on the quality of the work done. As seen by the level of submissions, the number of submissions, this was a high-profile matter with quite a lot of public interest. The quality of the reporting and clearly the quality of the work done through the hearings panel is worthy of note. So I'd just like to thank those people for their role in getting us to the point that we're at today and the ability to hopefully accept their recommendation.
Good. All right, Yanni?
Yeah, I too want to acknowledge the hearings panel, and I think it is in some ways the unique nature of these 2 processes going on, which I think is quite tricky. For me personally, I'd rather prefer that we wait until the minister's decision is made, rather than address this today. So I won't be voting for it. I'll be abstaining from it because I believe that it would be really important to get the resource consent planning issue sorted first before we consider the lease. I think there's a number of questions in my mind as to what we might want to have in the lease if the decision was a certain way. So, but I do want to acknowledge the huge work that's gone in and all the people that have taken time to submit. I think it's been a really good process.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, I too thank the panel and the work done by them and all the submitters. Often a lot of people that are in favour of things don't come out. This time they did. And I'd also show some respect to the people that submitted against. They are a very strong, passionate voice, and that's what gives us balance in the city. So thank you to those that do speak up and voice the concerns of members of our community. It's not lost on me, this one though, that once in a great book it said, "Let there be light," and it's Christmas week. So I don't know if that was done on purpose, timing-wise, but yeah, just thank you, Lord.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. That's carried. And abstention from Jana Johansson. Thank you. Thank you